Great. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our fifth and final big topic talk on our online event series that we're running as part of the engagement programme as we look at redesigning Grosvenor Square. My name is Ed Green, and I'm a Senior Development Manager at Grosvenor. So it's a gloriously sunny evening this evening, so thank you all so much for giving up your time outside to come and spend it with us. And I really hope you enjoy the session. I think it's set to be a really great finale to the series. Welcome back to all of you who've joined us before, and a warm hello to those of you who are joining us for the first time. Today, we're going to be discussing urban ecology and what is the role of an urban square at the time of climate crisis. So this is a really timely discussion, and we hope there'll be lots of food for thought and lots of good discussion and conversation throughout. As I mentioned, the event is part of the engagement programme that we are conducting as we consider redesigning Grosvenor Square. And the square recently returned to Grosvenor's control, and we are looking at ways to invest in it to make it more suited to the demands of an urban green space in the 21st century. We think that the lessons that we're learning from this process are going to be equally applicable to other urban spaces. So today we want to think about not just Grosvenor Square, but urban spaces, on the London scale, and then perhaps specifically about what that might mean for the square. So I'm delighted today to be joined by four wonderful speakers who are going to help us explore this idea of urban ecology. Firstly, Daniel Raven-Ellison. So Dan is an explorer, geographer, and the founder of London National Park City. Daniel's work focuses on inspiring people to think in new ways about places and how to make them better. He is currently working with the National Park City Foundation to support emerging national park cities around the world. Next, we'll hear from Emily Hamilton. So Emily is Associate Director of Sustainability with me at Grosvenor, with a track record of delivering successful environmental and social impact projects, influencing sustainability decisions at UK and global levels of business. She is a full member of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment and a chartered environmentalist. She's particularly interested in the role of business to deliver positive transformational change at a global level by harnessing local expertise. Next, we'll hear from Alice Bell. Alice is a climate campaigner and writer based in London. She co-runs the climate change charity Possible and is currently writing a book on the history of the climate crisis. Her first book, Can We Save the Planet, was published by Thames and Hudson earlier this year. And finally, we'll hear from Gary Grant. Gary is Director of Green Infrastructure Consultancy and part of the design team Redesigning Grosvenor Square. He has been a consultant ecologist for more than 35 years, is a chartered environmentalist, fellow of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management, thesis tutor at the Bartlett UCL, and author of two books, The Water Sensitive City and Ecosystem Services Come to Town. So really excited to hear from all of those guys. But once again, we'll be helped through the next hour and a quarter or so by Catherine Gregg from Make Good. Make Good are helping us facilitate the whole conversation that we have been having with really everyone who has an interest in Grosvenor Square. And hopefully that conversation will continue to grow throughout the rest of this year and into next. She will be prompting some of the discussions with both our speakers and with you, the audience. So please get involved, share your thoughts in the chat or comment stream. And over to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you, audience, for all being here. I'm excited that we are going to be discussing urban ecology today with such a great panel. I always think it's interesting to remember that urban ecology is the study of how all living things work with each other and their surroundings. So we as humans are part of that system, and not just the wildlife and the planting, and I always think that's a good point to remember. So what is the role of an urban square in the time of climate crisis, and what is our role within that? That's what we're going to be thinking about for the next hour and a quarter, but both a London-wide scale. There are about 600 urban squares in London, so there's lots for us to learn from this discussion for other places, but also what it specifically means for Grosvenor Square. And just to give you all a shape of today's session, if you haven't been to any of the previous events, we're going to start off with a quick question to our panel, which will help us frame the discussion. And I would like to ask you as audience members to also respond to that question in the chat function. If you don't know where that is, it's at the bottom of your Zoom window in the middle. If you click that, it'll bring up the chat channel and you can put your answers to the questions that I pose along the way in there. And then we're going to have some 5-minute snappy presentations from each of the speakers, followed by a discussion where I'll be putting questions from you to the panel. So please do pop your questions for them into the chat channel or the Q&A channel. Don't worry about where it goes because my team are on hand to pick them out and send them over to me. And we'll get to the bottom of what we think the role of an urban square is at this time. So finally, we're going to end with then what we think the learning is going to be for Grosvenor Square. So without further ado, I'm going to start with a question both for the panel and for you as audience. And that question is, what are the ingredients of a great urban space? So Dan, I'm going to come to you first to answer that, please.
Well, I think there are lots of things that are really important for a great urban space. I think one of them for me definitely is about it being really inviting. You know, it's about a place where you want to go and enjoy and that it's welcoming to you no matter who you are. But I think one of the key ideas I want to get across today is that we really need to use our urban squares to galvanize people to take action on some of the big problems that we face today, whether that's around the health crisis, the ecological crisis, or around the climate crisis. So not just to think of these spaces as places just for sheer pleasure, but actually as activist spaces to create more of the solutions that we need to see across the city.
Fantastic. I love that idea of galvanizing for people and planet. That sounds amazing. So Emily, building on that, how do you think we start thinking about how our urban spaces can perform best environmentally?
I think we also need to look at adaptability in the sense that we know our climate's changing and we know the city demographics changing, and how do we make our places fit for the future? So if you're designing for something in the 20th or 21st century, so 2020, how do we make sure that it's going to be okay for 2030, 2050? And what do we need to do, and what parameters do we need to put in place to make that happen? So I think adaptability is absolutely key.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's really useful. I think thinking about the future. So Gary, from an ecologist perspective, what do you think the important ingredients of a great urban space are?
Well, for these larger spaces like squares and parks, those are where you've got an opportunity to have huge trees, or trees that will become huge. Because as you know, in the streets nowadays, we tend to go for smaller trees because the larger ones are a nuisance. We can't get huge trees on buildings. They're the small trees if you're lucky. And so that's where we really need to think about huge trees and space for those trees, and also expose soil for those trees to let their roots really explore. You know, they again in the streets the roots are constrained, so that's really what we have to bear in mind. It's space for some forest trees perhaps.
Fantastic. Well, I know that in the other conversations that we've had on this topic, trees has come up an awful lot. So I'm sure people will be really delighted to hear you talk about the importance of trees there. Alice, so over to you. What would be on your ingredients list?
Well, I definitely like the idea of trees, and I like the idea of thinking in the future and of encouraging people to see it as activist spaces. But I guess the thing I'd add is that for me, just speaking as a Londoner, as someone who's always lived in central London and has really loves the fact that as a Londoner I have so much green space, often in small little pots as well as the big central parks, is it somewhere that we can all come together. And that's something I've really been noticing in the last few months as I rediscover some of my local parks during lockdown. You know, I've been running and walking in the local area rather than going into my usual commute, and seeing people interact. Well, one of the things that's been interesting about COVID, it's been watching people separate from each other and still staying in their little isolations. And that's been kind of heartening in some ways and also really depressing. And I think thinking ahead of like post-lockdown, I'd really like people who are thinking about urban squares to be thinking about how they can be places where people come together, because they're shared space and they're a reason why we can come together. And that is so rare and easy to avoid in London. So that's what I'd add, somewhere that brings people together.
fantastic. I think it's always great to remember about the people component of this. So it sounds as if I'm hearing correctly, there are a couple of different things that we're going to be touching on. So one, definitely the ingredients. I think within your talks, you're going to talk about that a bit more. But, you know, I would say definitely maximising the ecological and environmental benefit, perhaps more than minimising it. It feels like you talked about adding rather than taking things away. And then I think this adaptability, future looking, and making sure that people are a really important part of that. And I'm going to add a little one, just throw one in there, which is about how we do those things boldly. Like, I think it's going to be important for us to hold that in our minds as we approach this discussion. So we're going to hear from our first speaker now. Dan is going to introduce us to thinking about our green spaces and network on a citywide scale and what the benefits can be of changing even the smallest of spaces so that they improve the experience for people and contribute to improving the urban environment. So Dan, over to you.
Hi, great. Yeah, so my name's Dan. I'm a Guerrilla Geographer and I've been involved with the London National Park City from very early on. If we can have the next slide, please. So, and then let's go to the next one as well. We've only got 7 minutes. So London, no, back again. There we go. No, slide number 2. Thank you very much. Great. So London is an incredible, awesome city, one of the best cities in the world, without a doubt. It's a city that not only many of us on this call inhabit, but it's a city of nearly 15,000 species. Nearly half of London is physically green. We've got 3,000 parks. I think we said about 600 garden squares. So we have an incredible amount of abundance and diversity and beauty in this city. And Alice says as well, incredible public spaces that we can enjoy and mix together, which are just so important for us as well. But if we go to the next slide, you know, despite the fact we have all these spaces and all this diversity within the city, at the same time, these spaces are not actually equal. And I think many of them could be doing much, much more for us. So the idea of the London National Park City is partially about celebrating all those fantastic things that people have been doing, from top-down policy to grassroots action over hundreds of years, creating this landscape that we have. But it's also about recognizing that we share many great pains and threats, and we need to think about how we can overcome them. So I'm going to quickly take you through a tour of 3 different London spaces that I think are absolutely fantastic, and just give you one idea, one sort of thought to go away with after this short talk. And give the next slide, please. So this here is one of my favourite spaces in London. I live in Hanwell and Ealing in the far west of London, and I fantasize about spaces like this one over in Hackney in East London. If we can go to the next slide. So this is Dalston Curve Garden. This is a space where people can meet and socialise in a space in London which is otherwise in one of the most urban and grey parts of town. And it's a place where children can grow food. It's a place where people can enjoy talks and theatre. It's a place where you can go for a coffee and download with friends. And you can also hear sort of bees and see butterflies weaving their way through this very small space. This place is tiny, and it is born out of the threat of being a meanwhile space where people have had to come together to fight to save that space and keep it alive so that people can enjoy it as much as possible. If we go to the next slide. Another one of my favourite places, this is Bethnal Green Nature Reserve, which is in Tower Hamlets, where there's this fantastic project called Phytology, if we can go to the next slide. And this is where artists and culture makers and poets mingle together with ecologists, thinking about every single way that they can pack as much as possible into this tiny space, from campfire clubs to a mini wetland to this fantastic cultural provocation, which is actually a dead hedge. This is a former bomb site that after the war was constantly under threat from either people wanting to trash it in one way or another or harm it in one way or another. And through that threat, people came together to think about all the ways in which they could make this site a beautiful place for people to learn and spend time together. We can go to the next slide, please. So now this, you might recognise, is Bonington Square in Lambeth. I think this is an absolutely fantastic place. You can just about see Vauxhall up in the top left of the image there. And this is a site which I love because whenever I sort of walk into this space, you can hear the amplification of birdsong increase as you go closer towards these urban canyons because of the abundance of plants, both in the pleasure garden, where there's art and things you can enjoy in the cafes and street culture spilling out onto the streets. But what I really love about this space is the blurring of lines that exist between people's houses and the nature space to the northeast of the image into the streets, where street corners, we can go to the next image, where street corners have been eaten away so they can have as much plant life as possible in the streets. And people have got flower pots, big flower pots, small flower pots, gushing out by their doors. And again, this is a part of London where the history of this place is it was threatened because it was all going to be redeveloped into a school. The place was occupied by squatters who then looked after these spaces, eventually got permission to look after it. And through that threat, through that existential threat of the topicide, the destruction of this place, we have one of the best places to visit in London, one of the best, very best squares. So we can go to the next slide, please. You know, my takeaway is that when I think about many of London's commons and parks and public spaces, is how boring and uninviting and how unwelcoming so many people are, and how they lack diversity that we maybe have within the messiness of in our gardens, how homogenous and sterile many of them are, and how often so many of our public spaces are just for so few people. What I would like to see in great urban squares is thinking about not only how they can, you know, move from being passive and move on to being just inviting, but thinking about how they can proactively galvanize people around a different kind of threat that we all face now on a global scale. You know, this combined threat of our ecological crisis, the climate emergency, the health emergency we find ourselves in at the moment, the impending financial crisis we find ourselves in as well. So on all these different parts, these squares need to work really hard for us, just in the same way that the small ones do. And we have too many complacent large squares and large parks where the complacency means that they lack innovation and lack the drive that is necessary to make them really flourish. So we go to the next slide, please. So I'd like to see parks in terms of my ingredients and squares that are galvanizing, inspiring, inviting, joyful, replicable, and super multifunctional. And in terms of some bigger spaces that might be familiar to you that I think we should take inspiration from, it's thinking about the type of activities that take place at Capel Manor College, Kew Gardens, Eden Project, the Centre for Alternative Technology, in terms of not just being something, but showing people what they can be and trying to do the best we can to scale up the solutions that we have in London already in a quicker, more equitable way across the city, so that not just this square can benefit, but squares and parks across the city can benefit too. That's me.
Wow, thank you, Dan. That was a whistle-stop tour through some amazing stuff. So many gorgeous examples of green urban spaces that just make us smile and offer respite. And it definitely really awakened me at the end when you started talking about how larger spaces can do more, because I think you're right. I think so often it's these tiny little spaces that we see real innovation, and it'd be great to see that translated onto a larger scale. So thank you for that. Emily will now offer us some examples of how we can bring this thinking into urban squares in a physical way to allow them to support clean air, water management, and temperature control. So thank you, Emily. Over to you.
Great, thank you, Catherine. Wow, that's something to follow after Dan's really energising start. So my role at Grosvenor, I'm Associate Director. I lead on sustainability strategy. I'm currently working on our net zero carbon pathway for our business. But I have a huge passion for nature, and everything we do, trying to make sure that if we are going to be a climate resilient business, we're also putting as much emphasis onto the importance of nature-based solutions as we are for technological solutions. So in that frame of mind, we've been thinking a lot about climate resilience and what we can do to try and make our spaces more resilient for the future. So next slide, please. And the next one, because that's not particularly fun. Great, okay, so we already know we've got extreme weather. It isn't something that is happening in the future, it's here now. On the left-hand side, that's a picture of London in torrential rain. And it was only last week, I think, we had torrential rain. I seem to be making a habit of going cycling every Saturday and coming back absolutely soaked as the heavens are opening. On the right-hand side of this picture, we can see that's the Bloomberg building when there was a massive flood a few years ago. And what this shows is that the Bloomberg building's lights are still on, but all around it is flooded and no one can access that building. And therefore we need to think about not just buildings, but the spaces within the buildings. And that's why sort of squares and green spaces are so important in the fabric of our city. Next slide, please. So I'm sure many of you probably realise this already. Nature-based solutions, trees, rain gardens, lakes, you know, these can all help future-proof our city. But we don't always see that many great examples in our large spaces. The place that I really like is Burgess Park. So I was a member of their friends group for several years and really kind of saw that space from a space where people wouldn't go because at the very, very worst, they were scared of being hurt, to not really feeling like it was a space to them, to a space that you walk into today and it is absolutely teeming with people, and there isn't almost enough space for everybody who wants to go and use that park. But what I really like about this space in Burgess Park is what you can see in the background, which are the trees. And these trees are part of something called a wet woodland. So when the rain falls and the lake overflows, the wet woodlands start to soak up that rainfall, and it starts to limit the amount of flooding that happens to the rest of the park. And we can see in Burgess Park where they still need to do more work, and that hasn't been done because there are huge pots of, or almost parts that are flooded. So it's, I think, looking at things like nature-based solutions and how you incorporate them into the different spaces and functions of a green space is really, really important. Next slide, please. Another example are rain gardens, and Burgess Park is a good example of that again. As a large park, so as the entrances, they even put in rain gardens that again absorb heavy rainfall. But if you actually look in other places around the city, in Victoria, down in southwest London, in the centre, you've got John Lewis, and they've put in a rain garden in Victoria. So in the middle of the city centre, they've actually started to put in these gardens that are dipped down so that when the rain falls, it's amalgamated into a dip, and then that can then be absorbed and spread, and it helps to limit the amount of rain that suddenly is going into our gutters, into our drains, and can start to limit and start flooding. So rain gardens again are another really important example, and we could be looking at that for Grosvenor Square and how we incorporate it. Next slide, please. And then going a bit more controversial, I came across this really interesting study by Ramboll, who are a big multidisciplinary engineering consultancy. And they're starting to look at what happens when we really start to get extreme rain. And we are designing our spaces to be resilient, but not necessarily fully understanding the impact of the surrounding areas. So they've started master planning cities to look at, are there certain streets or certain places that could potentially become temporarily completely flooded to allow other spaces in the city to sort of carry on as normal? And they're looking at master plan level across the city at how this can be done. And I find this absolutely fascinating. Next slide, please. So Ramboll's concept is that you would have a city level master planning for flood adaptation, so that you have so much greening and purposeful sort of thinking about how it links into rain gardens, to different types of grasses, to trees. But at some point, that isn't going to be enough. So next slide, please. And we may find ourselves in a situation where we've got areas that are totally flooded because of these extreme periods of rainfall. So what if Grosvenor Square could be used to help actually limit the amount of rainfall that is in our surrounding streets, and that could impact on people's accessibility to their homes, to their work, to their properties? And only temporarily this might happen, but we accept that Grosvenor Square can actually become somewhere that can absorb this water, and we design it in that way. Next slide, please. So my key learnings are that we should investigate further the flooding risks of the streets surrounding Grosvenor Square. Grosvenor is already involved in a project called Wild West End, where we look at how to integrate all the different green roofs, trees, roof gardens across the West End. So we could actually look at it at a West End level. That we should be prioritising nature-based solutions like wet woodlands, rain gardens, and be working with our water engineers, landscape architects, ecologists and master planners. And we should also just consider, if we need to, if Grosvenor Square has the capacity to be totally flooded at certain points, because we all know that often people and rainfall don't go that well together. So how do we make these spaces flexible, adaptable, and really think about their multifunctionality, which Dan outlined to begin with? And that's it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emily. It makes me think of a studio space that I used to have where I looked out the window one afternoon and the entire road was literally kind of 3 feet deep in water. And we imagine that these are things that don't happen in London, but they do. So it's a really important point to make. It's also great to have some tangible examples that we can imagine translating to spaces that we know. So we're going to move on now to Alice, who's going to challenge us to think more ambitiously about the role that our urban squares can play as part of the city's ecosystem, looking at power and energy. So thank you, Alice. Over to you.
Hello. Yeah, do you want to put on to my second slide, probably, because I'm just going to holding one to start with. So the one after that. Thanks. Right, I'm going to talk a bit about tech because I am really into nature-based solutions, and I know Burgess Park very well and have done for years, and I did not know it was a wet forest, so I've learned something that I will definitely take with me and tell all my friends and neighbours today. And yeah, at Possible, we do quite a bit of community tree planting stuff, and if anyone wants to talk to us about community rain gardens, we would be very up for geeking over that with you. But I thought, because other people in this panel were probably going to take a more kind of traditional ecology point of view and talk about greening and things sort of relating to nature-based solutions and our relationship with nature, I wanted to bring in something about our relationship with technology, because I'm very aware as a former sociologist of technology, but also as an activist who works a lot on energy, that a big part of the climate crisis comes down to our arguably very dysfunctional relationship with technologies. And some of these are amazing technologies. I mean, the things that we have built with the same things that are now causing the climate crisis are incredible. They have brought warmth and heat and shelter and food to people around the world. They've done this very unevenly, and they have done this at a huge environmental cost, but they're pretty incredible. And I just think, I've been spending a lot of the last year writing this book on the history of the climate crisis, which has forced me to go back in a more granular level than I usually do on the kind of like the way in which we built the oil industry or our electricity networks and things like that. And it's outstanding. Well, it's astonishing that humans have done this. I find it's one of those things that's a really traditional sense of awe, in that it's something that we are kind of, it's not awesome as in that's great, it's awesome as like, oh, I don't really know. I mean, I'm kind of in awe of it, in this sort of liminal position that's a bit kind of terrified and excited at the same time. And I think it's really important that we think cleverly and thoughtfully about tech, and think about what is it about it that we really like and what is it that we don't like. And like electricity is a really, I think, the one that we really need to be thinking about quite carefully in this, because in many ways electricity has been a real villain of the piece. One of the reasons why we have burnt so many fossil fuels is to produce electricity. You know, I went for a walk at lunchtime, and I ended up going around Tate Modern, old electricity power station. People don't always realise that that was an electricity power station that burned oil. These days we hardly ever burn oil for our electricity, but that big art gallery on the South Bank used to burn stupendous amounts of oil that would come up in tankers along the river in the middle of the city to produce our electricity. We get through coal. We know we in the UK are celebrating that we're not having coal in our electricity grid anymore, but we do still burn quite a lot of gas in order to make our electricity, and we need to remember that. And electricity, though, will in many potentially be a bit of a hero. Like we were all talking about electric vehicles. I'm sure in the Grosvenor Square stuff, a lot of people have been lobbying you to have lots of electrical charging points. They probably actually haven't been to Grosvenor Square for, well, certainly the last 2 months, but I'm sure you've already got electrical charging points there. That, you know, it's a big thing that people talk about in urban spaces, the electrification of as much as possible, because that electricity gives us a choice. We can make electricity from low carbon, different options. So I want to think about how we can have a better relationship with technology, invite us to think about that. And I'm going to do it with really rather specifically by just talking about heat pumps, which is what this sort of little cartoon picture is that I've got up. It is an illustration from a report that we produced working with London Borough of Hackney and Nesta on the potential use of heat pumps in parks. Now, a heat pump, can I have the next slide, please? I'm not going to do a technical explanation of a heat pump. because we haven't got time, and also despite the fact that I've worked in science communication for several decades, it is quite a difficult thing to explain. So I think if you're really interested in how a heat pump works and you don't know, Google it. We've got some really good explanations on the We Are Possible website, but there are some other explanations are also available. But basically it takes heat from different things. You can have a ground source heat pump, a water source heat pump, or an air source heat pump. And the ones that we're talking about are the ground ones. So you bury them underground and they can absorb some heat that's already in the ground. You know, the sun has shone down on the ground, it's produced some heat, absorb some of that heat, and then it can share it with the community, and the community can put it to use. They can use it instead of burning gas, which is how most of us get heat, hot water and radiators and other forms of heat in our homes. Instead of using gas for that, we can have it be part of a heat network, and it could come from a heat pump. Now, people, I find when I talk about heat pumps, if you live in a city, you've probably never heard of them, unless you're a bit nerdy about energy, or you know someone who lives in the countryside who might have a heat pump or know someone who has one. Because for a ground source heat pump, you need quite a bit of space. And unless you have a very luxuriously large garden in London, it is unlikely that you'll be able to really make it work with a ground source heat pump. My brother actually lives in Hanwell, not far from Dan, and he has an air source heat pump in his flats, but they're still pretty rare in London. We had an amazing program. There's a report on our website called Lost Rivers, which would be using water source heat pumps in London's lost rivers, like the Effra, basically sewers, but we call them lost rivers because it's a little bit more romantic. But we think that you could have urban-based ground source heat pumps if you just put them in parks. And we also are interested in this because one version of doing this whole project would be that we work with councils like Hackney Council or Lambeth or Southwark, whoever wants to work with us, and we go and we dig up a park when a bit of it's being dug up anyway, and we do it in the middle of the night when no one's involved. We lay some heat pumps and then we plug it into the local school or business, and nobody is involved in that. But we feel very passionately that a big part of the reason why we've got into this problem is that we have allowed this incredible infrastructure, which we should remember connects us to our neighbours. Like, it's very cooperative in some, I mean, the people who first were building and talking about the electrical grid, you know, they really thought about it, some with very socialist visions, but a lot also with a very co-op movement model of people working together. And yet this thing that connects us has been hidden, literally buried from us, in a way that we just allow ourselves to completely ignore this incredible engineering feat that has, and centuries of science and technology that has gone into building our water network, our gas network, and our electricity network. So we don't want to hide that. So we want to tap into things like partner user groups, so people in the community can work together to think about where they might put their heat pumps, whether it would work for them, how they might use it, and have a potential chance to invest in it and to take the financial benefits of it too. So for my last slide, we would be drawing on, could you just move? Yeah, we would be drawing on as inspiration the community energy projects, which have used solar, mainly solar, but some wind electricity generation, and use that as a reason to connect people, not just to their energy system, but to their neighbours. And I've got a slide up from what I think is one of the most inspiring community energy projects in the world, and it happens to be a London-based one, which is Repowering London. And what they do here is a picture of them up in the top of an estate in Brixton, where they train up kids that live on the estate. They become solar interns, and they install the solar panels themselves, and they generate the finances they need to install the solar from the local community, and then the local community get the economic benefits as well as the low carbon energy, and are just connected to their energy in a completely different way. So they find they don't waste it, they have conversations about climate change, everyone is involved in decarbonisation in a way that I think is a lot more involving. So that's what I'd like to see urban squares do more of, is think about how they connect it technological infrastructure as well as ecosystem services and trees and nature-based solutions, and see if they can find ways to help people connect through those squares to have a better relationship with the technological solutions as well.
Amazing. Thank you, Alice. I was actually scribbling down notes as you were speaking, hence my little pause there. I think it's really great for you to challenge us to think more boldly, but also I think what an amazing point that we are so disconnected from how energy is created and our role in consuming it and our role in the urban environments that it creates for us. So I love the idea of making that gap smaller and somehow using these urban spaces as a way of generating that knowledge. So thank you. Gary is going to build on the idea of being more ambitious and give us some ideas about how we could sustainably deal with water, air pollution, temperature control, and maximising the potential for these approaches in Grosvenor Square. So thank you, Gary, over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. We can go to the next slide. You know, when you're the last speaker, you're repeating, aren't you, what people have already said. So apologies for that. But my mum used to say that things didn't sink in straight away and that I had to be told several times. And I'm assuming there are some of you out there have to be told several times before it sinks in. So that's the reason that you've got for the repetition here. So the next slide is just a reminder. This is from the Stockholm Resilience Institute, that we have these global problems, and biodiversity loss is, according to them, the most serious problem. We're talking about mass extinction, and we need to address this everywhere we possibly can. This isn't just for the Amazon or for Papua New Guinea or for the countryside or for Scotland or Wales. We have to do everything we can wherever we are. So it's just a little reminder, but I know I'm preaching to the converted. Now the next slide is a short list of some of the problems that we have in cities, and there's a huge amount of evidence that's been built up over the last 10 years by our academic colleagues to show that all of these problems, to some extent, can be alleviated by bringing more soil, water, and vegetation into cities. We call it green infrastructure. And of course, we always used to think that, but now we've got the evidence, we've got piles of evidence. So we're past the point where, you know, 10 years ago, people used to say, I'm not convinced that, you know, that greening really is going to help. We know that it's going to help. And I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just looking at some examples of that. So the next slide is just to drop down back into Grosvenor Square again and to think a little bit about biodiversity. So Grosvenor Square is typical of many of the conventional open spaces that there are in London and elsewhere, in the sense that it's almost like a cartoon landscape. Because of mechanization, we've lost most of the biodiversity that we should have there. There are not that many species, there's virtually no cover for wildlife. So at the end of this talk, I'll be giving a few suggestions of how we can bring biodiversity back into Grosvenor Square and other squares as well. So huge waste of opportunity in terms of biodiversity. Now the next slide is showing air pollution in London, and of course there's a serious problem. We're exceeding World Health Organization guidance. Central London is particularly bad, and the next slide shows how the roads are really the source of most of that air pollution. So you can see that Oxford Street and Park Lane, where all the traffic's going, is bad, but even some of the larger roads in Mayfair have a serious air pollution problem. And what's interesting is that plants have been shown to either intercept some of that pollution or absorb it if it's gaseous, or if it's particles, to slow the air down so it drops out. And so there's a lot of interest in using vegetation to shield us from air pollution. So that's something we can bear in mind. Of course, ultimately, we want to clean up the transportation to hydrogen and electric. But in the meantime, in that 10 or 20 year period, during the changeover, we may need to use vegetation to shield ourselves. And of course, that's not a high regret thing. Even if the air gets cleaner, we'll still have that vegetation to give us all those other benefits. Now, the next slide is just really a checklist of all the things that we're looking for. We've already heard about most of them. But there are one or two perhaps that we can go into in a little bit more detail in the next couple of minutes. So the next slide shows the front page of this textbook that came out a couple of years ago, which is a review of the evidence for green space improving health. And for a long time, it's been known that green space encourages exercise and movement, which is particularly good. But there's a lot of fascinating work that's been done very recently to show how our mental health can be improved, and how the development of children that are seeing greenery is better than children that are not. So fascinating, really important, and something that we need to bear in mind. So the evidence is there, huge textbooks and lots of new publications. Now, people have mentioned the urban heat island. The next couple of slides look at that. So if we can just flip on and on to the next one. And this shows, this is in Osaka, and this is really interesting because it shows the dramatic cooling effect of green infrastructure. So on a hot summer's day, in the middle of the day, where you've got roads and railways and roofs and dense sealed surfaces, temperatures can get up into the 50s degrees centigrade. But if you have greenery, trees, and in this particular example, there's a roof garden on a podium, you can see that the temperature's held down by as much as 20 degrees centigrade, and that's the shading and the evaporative cooling. And this, of course, could save lives in a heat wave. It would save energy for air conditioning. So it's a huge effect. It's passive, it's free once you've created that green space or enhanced it. So this is something that should not be overlooked. The next slide is, again, repeating what others have said. I think Emily was talking about this. So this is what our colleagues in China call the sponge city. So, you know, the problem is that in the past, we've seen water as a problem. We put water into downpipes, into sewers, into rivers and watercourses. We've caused flooding downstream. We've caused pollution downstream. And the new approach is to make the city the sponge city. So as we've heard, we might deliberately flood a park. We might have a wet woodland instead of a woodland. We would have green roofs. We would have rainwater harvesting. Where streams have been put underground, we would bring them to the surface. We call that daylighting. So the sponge city is thousands and thousands of individual projects all over the city in order to get that effect of holding water, cleaning water, reducing pollution, and improving the evaporative cooling, which we've already heard about. So that's something that we want to be part of, the sponge city. And just a reminder that that flooding in the next slide, that flooding actually causes huge disruption to transportation, to work, the workplace and so on. So it's extremely affordable. There's no question it pays off. The next slide is a look at what our colleagues have done in Portland, Oregon. So this is a city where they want the water that flows into the river to be cleaner to maintain the quality for salmon. So they have these rain gardens. Now, they also like the idea of depaving. And in this case, they wanted to slow the traffic. So the next slide shows a couple of rain gardens which slow the traffic. They receive a runoff which goes into the rain garden, and then when they're full, if they're full, they can then overflow to the conventional drains. But this is something that we can do in our streets, in our parks. And the next slide shows you a huge breakthrough. So when we make a lot of these street side rain gardens, we cut through the curbs, and that's a difficult thing to do in some places because it's not in the rule books. And Tom Lipton, who pioneered this in Portland, Oregon, I was talking to him and I complained that it took me a year to get permission to do this in West Sussex. And he told me it took him 17 years to get permission to do this in Portland, Oregon. So we're at a really exciting stage because other people have done all the hard work to show how to do this stuff, to prove that it's not too scary or too expensive. So we can take all of these examples and start to apply them in London and other cities. Getting there, not many slides now. Next one is, this is about multifunctionality. So here we've got a rain garden in Hammersmith in Fulham, Joist Square. So water flows from the streets into this rain garden, and that's good. But we had the great breakthrough here where someone said, let's make it for play as well. Of course, people said that's too dangerous. It'd be much safer for the kids to scooter along the street. I don't think so. They might fall off. Actually, they very rarely fall off, and so on and so forth. So again, we're getting breakthroughs now where people have actually done this stuff. They brought play into places where previously it wouldn't have been allowed. So this is an example of this super multi-functionality that we've heard about earlier. Next slide is really just my suggestions for Grosvenor Square. Of course, you've heard I'm most interested in biodiversity, but I think we can do a lot of other things as well. So we've got the skeleton of a woodland there. We've got big trees, but we haven't got the bits of woodland that you'd expect in a woodland, the understory, the ground flora. So I think we can probably get some of that into there. The other thing is we've got grass, which is great for recreation, but some of it could be more biodiverse, wildflowers. So maybe we can have meadows. We can definitely absorb more rain. We can make more of the sponge city. We might increase the boundary planting because we want to shield the noise and the pollution. We can get lots of features in there for wildlife, bird boxes, loggeries, bug hotels. I'm sure most of you have seen this stuff. And of course, we can make it high tech and keep Alice happy. We can have cameras and Bluetooth and 5G, and we can be looking at infrared and listening to ultrasound. So there's all sorts of interesting stuff that we can do with that. And the other thing is about the stewardship or nurturing of our open spaces. So instead of just whipping around with a machine, a mower, in the future, I think it's going to be much more about gardening rather than mowing. It's about interacting with volunteers, conversations that take place between maintenance guys and women and people and the public, rather than it's just a guy who comes around with a strimmer and drives off. So I think the way that our spaces are looked after is going to be essential so that we can not only spend money on some good projects, but look after them for the long term. So that's that concludes my presentation. Hopefully we're not too late.
Thank you, Gary. That was great, and I think there's nothing wrong with repeating things. I think it's really great to think about them in different contexts and different ways that they can be applied to Grosvenor Square. So that concludes our presentations from our panelists. Ed Green is going to join us now for a discussion. Audience, this is your moment for questions. We've been collecting them, so I'm going to start us off, but please do add in more questions and I'll put them to the panel. So Ed Green, I'm going to come to you first about the subject of electricity and thinking about not just Grosvenor Square, but does Grosvenor not have other, like here it says defunct underground car park spaces or other places in which around their estate which could also be used as electric charging stations, or things that would also enable kind of air and noise pollution reduction?
Well, that might actually be a better question for Emily. But I mean, yeah, I think, you know, we're looking at opportunities left, right and centre across the estate, how we can do things better. I don't know, Emily, do you want to pick up on that?
So in terms of electric charging points, we've installed some for our suppliers already down in Belgravia. I think we're in constant discussion and dialogue with Westminster City Council about how we can install more in Mayfair. And I think when it comes to things like energy in general, we've actually just put a tender out to consultancies to see who can come back with the most innovative and exciting ways we can generate energy from our public realm, as well as our buildings. So we've got solar panels on our roofs already, but we think there's more we can be doing to maximise energy generation from our public realm. And I think Alice's point about heat pumps and air source heat pumps is really important. And it's something that us and a lot of other developers are working hard to incorporate all of these technologies into our new developments and to retrofit our properties as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's something really interesting about somebody raising the idea of electric charging points, because actually when we did the access and or accessing the outdoors version of this talk, there was a lot of discussion around is the aim really to focus on people like pedestrians as opposed to focus on vehicles. So yes, kind of electric vehicles would be potentially a positive thing, but well, it is a positive thing, but you know, it's about, you know, being bolder than that perhaps, and not thinking, you know, they still would cause congestion, I guess is the point. So Dan, I think lots of love for your idea of a super multifunctional space, but if I list out some of the things, so big trees, flood alleviation, ground source heat pumps, community space, different activities and education opportunities, we've talked a lot about different things that that one space can offer. Is it really possible for something to do, for a space to do all of those things, do you think?
Well, I mean, a garden, a humble garden or a humble balcony can do all the things that you just listed. So no, I think it definitely can. But I think the point that I was trying to make in my talk, and I think it's good to talk about in general, is the specialness of the location of where this square we're talking about is, both to London, to the country, but also its impact internationally as well. And so I think the responsibility it then has, not just to showcase what's possible, but I think actually thinking about upskilling people as well. So I think Gary went most of the way there in terms of talking about not just having people picking up the litter and just maintaining it, but I'm really inspired by these spaces like Capel Manor College, for example, which you do see in many London parks, like down in Crystal Palace, close to where I am in Gunnersbury, where people can actually learn skills that they can then do in their own balcony or garden or their own local square. So if there are 600 local squares in London, how can Grosvenor Square encourage a ripple effect where we see all this super multi-functionality happening across all those squares? That's what I would really like to see from this space. It can definitely do all those things. I mean, it definitely can.
I love that you could have just said yes. But...
yeah. A tree can do all those things. You know? A single, like, really good oak tree can do all the things that you just described.
Yes, no, you're right. So, Gary, thinking about kind of, I guess we've talked a lot about flooding and water management. So there's a question here about how the space can be, or that type of space can be made accessible to people and wildlife in summer when surface water is needed. So essentially, you know, can those things coexist? A way of dealing with water and accepting flooding as a thing in a place that actually people can, you know, access and experience that.
Well, there's a whole series of possibilities, aren't there? So I think we have to remember that and not see one example of one type of intervention and then say that's what we must have. So, you know, for instance, you see these examples of floodable playgrounds or floodable sports fields where they flood maybe once a year or every couple of years, and that's fine. But that's not always suitable. And often it might be that a whole series of smaller features might do the same job, or it might be that you combine features. So you need to really understand the topography and the hydrology of a site. And of course, we want to make sure that we're still providing all the benefits for people and not killing trees by flooding them too often and so on. So there's some great ideas there, and I'm not negative at all about it, but I think we have to be careful not to cut and paste from other projects. We need to analyze each site properly.
Yes, great points, and making sure that it's appropriate and the right choice for Grosvenor Square.
Yep.
So Alice, I think there's been lots of interest in thinking about things, thinking about power in a different way. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how those conversations are initiated with, because I guess for some people it seems slightly left field to think about this.
Yeah, it can be like sort of like, hey, do you want to set up a power plant with me, to your neighbours? It's it's difficult. And I mean, there's two sides to it. It's how it's initiated and then how it's allowed to grow to the next stage. So typically, community energy projects start with a couple of friends being like, we could do this, and they spark off each other. So some people read about, like, we worked quite a lot with a group in Sussex they'd been part of the first sort of wave of anti-fracking protests in Fulham. It's quite a few years ago, but some of you might remember this. And the community had come out of that kind of aware of energy in a different way, and they'd as a group, they were then inspired by some community energy, some community solar in Lewes, not far from them, and then they went and built this amazing project. And off the back of it, long story short, next summer you'll probably be able to get the train from Waterloo to the coast, and it'll be solar powered. And they kind of started that from a community energy group that also built a solar farm that gives enough electricity not just for their village but the village next door. So when that story started coming out, because we were working with them at Possible, we got lots of people inspired, emailing us going, I want to do this too. And what I wanted to be able to do was like, great, take that enthusiasm. You've been inspired, like riffing off each other, or have you seen some of the stuff that repowering does? But unfortunately, the government policy situation at the moment makes it really, really hard to go that next step. So we'd gone from a position maybe like 10 years ago that if you were inspired like the people in Balkan were, you could, with a lot of hard work, do that. And there were groups like us, there's groups like Repowering that kind of can help grow these things. There's Community Energy England, Community Energy Wales and Scotland. They can help give you a community and advice, but the government policy set up at the moment is just very, very difficult to do it. So it's only the most kind of sort of strident that get through. Like when I lived in Hoxton, I joined a group of people this group had already set up, some group of friends had set up a community energy group, and they were looking for more members, and they advertised, and I joined in, and we were all getting ready, and we went out and found all the roofs in the local area that would work as solar spots, and we were all excited. And then the government set up another set of cuts. So the first thing they start, if you're interested, if you're already inspired by, you've seen something, that's all you really need to get going. You just talk to some friends and work out. I would say though, it will take more effort than is fair at the moment, because the government needs to do more. I'm hopeful that in the next year we'll start to see a lot of these things open up, particularly where it comes with renewable heat, which is one of the reasons why I'm starting to get a little bit interested in heat pumps, and whether you can put heat pumps in interesting places like your local sports centre, or maybe down an old sewer. Is something that's worth doing, because potentially the renewable heat incentive, to get geeky, is going to open up potentially particularly for community groups. But it's also why people who've got any kind of power in community work or things like this, so councillors, people who are doing large scale projects like you, should be able to think about how they can help grow this seed of inspiration. Because up and down the country, there are people who would love to do something as ridiculous as build a power plant with their friends, and we should be helping them do that.
Yeah. Well, I guess the starting point is it's not ridiculous. I probably shouldn't have called it left field. It's kind of it's moving those things into the mainstream conversation, isn't it?
But it is possible. Like this group of community, like they're just normal members of a community. They're not experts. In Borkham, built this amazing solar farm, and yeah, they inspired the project, which needed to then do some work with scientists at Imperial. Like it's not just, and then they invented a solar train. It involved a lot more developed work, but they basically invented solar powered trains off the back of their community solar project, and we could all do that, if we just were able to.
I love your optimism. So, Emily, I think there's a question here about whether you could talk about the difference between something like a wet forest or a wet woodland concept versus something like a rain garden.
Difference in terms of which one's better, or difference?
It's like what the difference is. It sounds very promising given the water collecting properties of trees.
So I guess they're two different. A wet woodland is it's got a larger scale, in the sense a wet woodland is somewhere which is planted with trees which are able to be flooded. So you take species like black poplar, for example. They enjoy having water. Some species of birch, and so it's very dependent on the tree species. But potentially you could use that as a way to almost have a tranquil space for people to walk through in the square, compared to a rain garden where you actually might want to put that at the entrance to welcome people, because you can put bright, colourful flowers that really attract and inspire. So it goes back to this multifunctionality piece and working out, as Gary said, what the the topography of the land is and what's going to work in which places, and to be really thoughtful about how kind of thinking about it. We actually use a function chart from the Wild West End Partnership, which helps us work out where we think we should be putting in green infrastructure in different spaces, and thinking about the function. So it isn't just putting in a tree for the sake of a tree, is what will that tree do? Will it be good for biodiversity? Will it be good for air pollution? Will it be good for aesthetics? And trying to think about all of it in the round. So I think I would say one isn't better than the other. Again, it's just thinking about where you need those spaces, and next to a big pool of water like a lake, a wet woodland might work, whereas next to an entrance where you've got curbs, that's where sustainable urban drainage could be, and rain gardens can be really good.
Yeah, so it's like anything, it's not that one is better than the other, it's about using the right thing in the right context. So Ed, how much, as client on this, how much are you thinking about the square as a three-dimensional space? So not just what we see on the surface and above, things like underground as well.
I mean, yeah, I guess it's a huge opportunity. I mean, the space is very much the ground plane and then the large trees at the moment. And we've been talking with Gary and other members of the design team about how how variation in the topography, for example, can create new spaces within the square and create new habitats within the square and create new areas of temperature within the square. And that conversation has kind of led us to think about, are there different areas? There is a natural incline on the square that runs kind of from the southwest to the northeast corner. Northeast corner is a few meters lower. And I guess we've been thinking a lot about the water collection. There's been a big conversation that's been going on today. And actually, if we're going to try and have more planting, and we're going to have drier summers, then do we need to be looking at having effectively cisterns to store water for when we get these periods of heavy rain in the winter, so that we're able to sustain the biodiversity in the summer. And then, I don't know, you think if you're going to create a cistern, what if it was actually an experience? What if it was a space that people could go and experience that water while it's being stored, and you create a new environment? I think there's a kind of a lot of opportunities, you say, kind of from the tops of the trees right down to the mechanics and how you're storing, whether it's water or other pieces of kind of infrastructure that you need within the square.
But I definitely think, through this process, the idea of collecting and storing water has come up as an idea an awful lot from the community and from kind of audience participating in this. And then, Gary, if I think about your sponge city diagram, it had this pool of water, and it's got to go somewhere. And if it goes somewhere, I guess it's what you do with it, and can you experience it, is what you're saying, Ed. So, Gary, there's a kind of slightly controversial one here, so hold on to your hats. But there's, we've talked a lot about trees, and increase biodiversity and allow for better horticulture and provide an urban forest for the future. Is there an idea about thinking about some of the existing trees in order to, like, removing some of them, or thinking about what trees you add that would make a more diverse and climate resilient space?
Well, yes, that is controversial. It's probably worth bearing in mind that most of the trees in the square are what we call category A. So normally the local authority wouldn't let you remove them without very, very good reason. There are a few trees in there that are not in such good condition, or perhaps weren't well suited in the first place. So it is something that the tree experts are looking at. But I think in general, the approach would be to keep most of the trees, but to think long term about you know, over a period of 50 or 100 years, what you might be aiming for. Because, you know, if you look at the very beginning, when you were showing all those photographs down the centuries, you can see that over 100 years, there are a lot of changes that take place anyway. So probably in 100 years, we will still have a lot of trees there, but the London plain might start to be replaced in some cases by perhaps a more diverse canopy. And of course, we know that diversity gives us more resilience because you have a better chance of dealing with changing conditions. If you have monocultures, you're more vulnerable to disease, for instance. So I think there's a long-term plan, and then there might be some short-term improvements. So there are different time scales that we're looking at this, but I think you'd be very unpopular if you said we're going to cut down all the trees and start again. It may not be a bad idea if you're trying to do certain things, but I think that might be a bit of a shock.
Yeah, I think, no, of course, generally people absolutely love trees, and it would be bedlam. You know, I guess it's thinking about, are there additional trees or a kind of enhancing of the trees that are there at the moment that would, you know,
well, it's also worth, if I can just add to that, that not all trees are equally valuable in terms of the wildlife that they can support. So, you know, there's the classic studies of how London plain only supports 1 or 2 species of invertebrates, and English oak supports more than 350 different species. So you've got the diversity issue, all the different creatures that, you know, that grow in a tree, and also the biomass of things like aphids and so on, which you get more of in certain species than others. So, you know, we need to think about these things, as well as the beauty, as well as the suitability, and to look to diversify over a period. But it's not something that can be done overnight or even in 1 or 2 years. It's certainly the ground flora we can improve immediately, and the, you know, the wildflowers in the grasslands, or within a year or so. But trees is a longer term project, isn't it?
It is. So, Dan, I think you've definitely inspired people to think about kind of the connection of spaces. And I'm wondering what you think about the viability of connecting spaces like Grosvenor Square to other urban spaces in terms of that, I guess, reversing that urban habitat fragmentation. Sorry, there's someone driving very loudly down my road. Yeah, that reverse urban habitat fragmentation that we've seen happening. I guess, you know, this is the very reason of National Park City.
That's right, but I think that it'd be good to ask Emily about that question, actually, in the context of the square, in the context of Wild West End, and what Wild West End is doing to identify appropriate sites for making spaces greener and wilder, but also thinking about how that as a successful project can be translated into other parts of London as well, spreading out for the West End, going north, south, east and west. Yeah, I mean, just in terms of like a lived experience, like I know that there's a fantastic circular walk that I can do going east along the Thames, up, hitting the canal, looping all the way around the back up towards just to the north of where Paddington is. And then there's only a couple of very short steps, actually, where you can't do a completely blue and green walk as a human being, right, as a Homo sapien, going from Paddington into Hyde Park and then down towards Grosvenor before you get back down towards St James's and things. There's such an opportunity for people to be able to experience that and the benefits that us as animals that occupy this habitat that we live in, which is London. And I think that if we can't make those spaces more habitable for people, then actually it's quite hard to imagine how we'd make them more habitable for other animals that we might want to see within London's habitat as well. So I think we need to find ways in which we can actually remove cars as much as possible from key parts of that wider network coming out of the square, and not then just have them as spaces that are grey, but how we can make them, through projects like Wild West End, incredibly greener and wilder as well, through all the kinds of things that people have been talking about so far. But I think Emily should tell us about Wild West End.
Emily, do you want to come in on that?
Great, thanks Dan. So Wild West End was set up in 2015. It's a partnership between 7 of the property companies in the West End, the Great Estates. So the Crown Estate, Grosvenor, Shaftesbury, Great Portland Estate, Portman Estate, and I'll probably miss, and Howard de Walden. And we're in strategic partnership with the Greater London Authority, so the GLA, as well as London Wildlife Trust. And the aim of the Wild West End was really to catalyse a ecological corridor between Hyde Park and Regent's Park, east to west in a way, and then from north to south, going from Regent's Park down to Green, all the way down to Green Park, and to take all the different property companies in that area and look at how we can get them to work in collaboration. So we started off with 6 partners, that was then extended to 7. We've recently brought on business improvement districts as well. So Arup are the lead technical partner, and they've been working really hard to get engaged the bids, which then means that we can move beyond the property companies that are already involved and start to use the bids to engage other companies as well. And the ultimate ambition for Wild West End is to help the West End become, as Dan said, greener, healthier and wilder, but a particular focus on bringing bees, bats and birds back into the Wild West End. So we've been doing surveys every 2 years to check our progress and also lessons learned. And we did one survey one year and it was awful. Most of our roofs had died because of the poor climate. We just didn't predict how hot it would be. I think it was in 2018 when there was a really hot peak in the summer. It was like 31, 32. And from that we learned, actually, you need to put in more resilient roofs. So we went back and said, please, can you plant up roofs that are prioritising resilient wildflowers, lavender, things that are going to be able to address like periods of dry spells. So it's been a learning process, and we sort of meet quarterly to share what we're doing. But the aim really is to take Wild West End and to stretch that to other developers across London. And we're looking at doing that through the National Park City Forum. And it will be amazing if we can get that off the ground.
Fantastic. So we're slightly running out of time, but there's an interesting question here, which I think, Alice, is something that you touched upon in your little soundbite that you gave us around kind of how much we think about history or heritage within the context of thinking about urban ecology. So, I think there's people saying, well, this all sounds great, but what do we think about how this relates to history? So Alice, I'm going to ask you first to say something about how we think about future whilst respecting the past, and then Ed, I'm going to come to you.
Well, I guess I can give you a couple of examples just from ones that I have been spending some time in recently, and one of those is Burgess Park. So I didn't know that about the wet woodland, but I did know about the fact that it's from an old bomb site, but it was from Zeppelins, and like these sorts of things. I often say that to friends and neighbours, and they're like, Zeppelins? It's like, it's a bit of London history. People will know about the Blitz, but they don't realise that we were bombed before then. And you can kind of tell Park's a bomb site because it's a weird shape. And people just assumed it was the Blitz in World War II, not World War I. And that's a sort of story. It's kind of told, it's actually told very beautifully with some very beautiful bits of art that I think the only reason my neighbours haven't seen it is they just haven't been looking, but they are well presented. And if you know the park, you will know these weird little houses they have and the interpretation of that. And then there's also a park not far from that, the other side of Walworth Road, that used to be a zoo. And they've got a beautiful bit of art that, well, actually I say beautiful, it's a little bit unusual. I don't think it's to everyone's taste. They have some art, but it's striking. It looks a bit like a peacock, and it invites you to look at the interpretive panels. And you can do it with the kind of classic interpretive panels. And to be honest, I quite like a few more ones about some of the nature and biodiversity in places like Burgess Park, because I really appreciate them. In things like Archbishop's Park's got some really good ones by just not far from the hospital by the South Bank. But just through bits of art that inspire people to pull up some of the stories. And Grosvenor Square has got so many. I know Grosvenor Square as someone who used to work in Oxford Street and used to go and hide there as for some semblance of quiet and as a cycle route. But it's one of those bits of London that there are so many bits of stories you could tell, and it would be really lovely to have just a few bits of art that could lift some of that up and offer a bit of interpretation. But that work of doing a bit of art to lift it up could really help lift some of the ecological stories and some of the natural history stories as well as the human history stories.
Fantastic. Ed, anything to add on that?
No, I mean, it's just, I've been lucky enough to learn a huge amount about the history of Grosvenor Square recently, and it is, as you say, the stories are incredible. I mean, I think one of the things that has kind of struck me is that the history that we're very aware of is the last 80 years, or less, in fact. And a lot of what makes Grosvenor Square significant in its history is actually some of the things that have slightly been lost. It was the first oval square, and the oval has sort of become a lozenge. And there are kind of other interesting elements about it was the first place to have formal shrubberies in the UK. There aren't really many shrubs in the square at all anymore, and it feels like, I think Alice is bang on. There's kind of a lot of stories in there that can be brought to the fore again through this process, and by no means turning our back on the history that we have there at the moment. It's it's an absolutely it is a celebration of the British relationship with America that has obviously been so important since since the war and before, and we need to make sure that we're celebrating it and enhancing it, but also bringing more texture and more richness from the 220 years that sit behind that.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'm going to ask each of you to give me one key takeaway from today for the Grosvenor Square. And audience, if you could answer as well, that would be fantastic. So Dan, I'm going to come to you first.
I really think this meshing together, like Alice is talking about, of technology with nature, with interpretation, with culture, so that people have a really holistic experience, but building on what we also talked about in terms of multifunctionality that can be replicated elsewhere, I think are my sort of key takeaways. This combination of all these different beautiful things that can be brought to life through the square.
Fantastic, thank you. Emily?
I think building on that, what Dan said, purpose. So really thinking about every space and saying, what's the purpose of this space? What's the journey of the person going to be going through this space? What's the journey of the wildlife going to be going through this space? And to go back to this multifunctionality point, great spaces are those that almost divide up the areas and say, we're going to have this bit for tranquility, we're going to have this bit for play, and where they can, they will intermingle, but sometimes that's not possible. So I think always thinking about the purpose is really important.
Great, thank you. Gary?
My message is nurture rather than maintenance, because the reason that our open spaces are so boring is because that's the way they're looked after. It's mechanization. It's relatively cheap. So in the future, it needs to be about working together to look after places, because we can't install everything we want and keep it unless it's looked after forever and ever.
Good point, thank you. Alice?
I just want to lift something up from the comments that I don't think we spoke much about, so I think it would just to invite everyone else to think a bit about, which is the noise pollution issue. And I just, as someone who used to work in a very busy shop on Oxford Street and had one of the, working in a shop in Oxford Street over Christmas is a stressful experience, having a bit of green space to go to is a real lifeline. And that's also true for, for the people who live near there. I know that I live in a very noisy part of London, and some of the squares near me are places of peace. And at the moment, I'd say that Grosvenor Square isn't super peaceful still, because it's difficult for anything around there to be peaceful. It's a very loud bit of the city. But if you could think about what you could do to create that, and just for anyone else who's thinking about squares, that's something I think we didn't talk enough about, which is noise pollution. And I'd invite everyone to just reflect on that.
Fantastic, thank you, Alice. And Ed, you've got the difficult job of being the last person to give us your key takeaway.
My key takeaway from today is actually, it's kind of been striking me about how, I guess, how important Grosvenor Square is, or how important this opportunity is. And that, I guess in the context of the Wild West End that Emily was talking about, that this square sits, is such a kind of linchpin between Hyde Park and some of the other green spaces to the east of it. And because of its scale, it has such a potentially pivotal role in creating those sort of green corridors and the like. But also, and I don't know, Dan probably won't remember this, but when he and I first met, he came out with the line, "Every square matters," and he was talking about Grosvenor Square, but also a square foot or a square meter, and that actually if we can do this right, there's the potential for it to be really inspirational, and people can come and maybe learn about a way in which you can do horticulture or ecology yourself, whether it's in your garden or in on your balcony, or just, you know, at the end of your road. And it doesn't need, you know, what happens in Grosvenor Square doesn't need to be, you know, it can be replicable in a way that anybody can come and get inspired and learn from it. And I think that's really cool.
It is. It's a nice point to finish on. So thank you so much, everybody. I'm sorry we didn't make it to all of the questions. As we close, I wanted to promote a couple of upcoming events. So if you're local to Grosvenor Square, we have 2 local conversations you can attend this Saturday, the 27th of June, and between 11 and 12:30, and next Tuesday, the 30th, between 5 and 6:30. So there's, or actually no, it's between 12:30 and 2 next Tuesday. So there's 2 options of the same session, so you only need to come to one. We've been taking on board all the feedback that we've been gathering at these events, at the local conversations, the survey, and putting them into a set of priorities for Grosvenor Square, which are going to be used to hold the design accountable as we go forward. And we're going to be showing all of these as part of an open air exhibition in Grosvenor Square from the 14th of July to the 7th of August. And in an online discussion event and through an online exhibition. So we're going to send updates about that on the Grosvenor Square social media, but also through the mailing list. So links to sign up to those are going to be in the chat channel now. And we've also put a link to the short and simple survey that we've been using to collect people's priorities across all of the themes. If you want to do that, you can. That would be fantastic. And so thank you, panelists, Ed, audience, and thank you so much for participating. And I hope you participate again in July. Have a wonderful evening in the summer sunshine, everybody. And I'm just going to hand over to Ed to finish.
Thank you, Catherine. And well, yeah, what a program it's been. 5 talks, I think 22 speakers. And I think, you know, we've covered so much. And it's all, I guess, really been about how we get the relationship right between people and nature. And, you know, from discussing the potential for spectacular horticulture and biodiversity to what the ingredients are that make a healthy place, and how do we make our green spaces more accessible. It really has been amazing. I've learned so much, and I really want to say 3 thank yous. Firstly to our fantastic speakers, both today and in our previous events, who seeded such inspiring ideas that have helped us kind of have such fascinating conversations. To secondly, to you, the audience, who've joined us along the way. Your ideas, your feedback, your priorities is literally forming the foundations upon which we are designing this square. And I really cannot thank you enough for being so open and for sharing with us what it is you want to see in this space. And then finally to Catherine and the whole Make Good team, who have created, in fact curated, this whole series and helped us gather such meaningful insight from, I guess, the local and London communities, and in fact many people beyond. And as you can imagine, things had to change fairly dramatically when lockdown hit, and the team have just done an amazing job at helping us gather such amazing feedback. So thank you guys.